The messages we're kind of always hearing is that when you find your true love, you find ultimate fulfillment, and that it's kind of like this perfect thing.
I got a quick quiz for everybody. I think this will help us kind of get all on the same page. So raise your hand if right now at this stage of life you have a crush on somebody. So you really like them, you're really interested in someone. Maybe you haven't told them. That's
we know
fine.
There's more than that. Come on. If you're in this seminar, you probably have a crush on somebody, right?
Yeah, so yeah, raise your hand. Let's all be honest here. The first step in relationships is honesty, okay? Okay, so keep your hand raised. You've got a crush on somebody, you're interested in them. Maybe you've told them, maybe you haven't. All right, yeah, we got 2 hands over here, that's good. Okay, keep your hand raised. Everybody keep your hand raised. Okay, now keep your hand raised if your crush, the person you have a crush on, is at this conference.
Right?
Oh, wow.
There's a few, probably more.
All right, there's no shame, no shame. We got our hands raised.
Right.
Okay. Now raise them high and proud. Yeah, don't be shy. Now keep your hands raised if the person you have a crush on is in this room.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. We got a few. Okay, we will not make you stand and name that person. That's at your discretion. Yeah, right. We could arrange it right now. Well, the reality is, at different points in our lives, we all have interest in somebody, and we kind of hope maybe it will turn out like that. Like maybe your bus ride home will actually turn into a musical. I hope for the rest of the bus that might be the case, but probably not. So we're going to have just a couple discussion questions. We're going to take a few minutes. Just turn in your table and answer these questions together. Are these the images of love and romance that you want? And what are your expectations for dating and getting married? So we'll just take a few minutes. Not everyone has to share, but just discuss these at your table.
Okay, so we're going to wrap it up. You can talk more about that later if you want. So when I first met Kerby, I met him at a gas station. I was with my mom. He had met my mom actually before me. And anyway, my mom introduced me to him. And I wouldn't say it was necessarily love at first sight, but I would say it was definitely interest at first sight on my part, okay? Unfortunately, the interest was not reciprocated for a while. So I liked Kerby for like 3 years before we actually ended up started dating. It's okay, it worked out, right? We're married, we have a baby.
We're here, all right? It worked out.
Yeah. So I liked him for about 3 years, and then eventually he came around and realized that he also liked me. And so my kind of story, similar to 500 Days of Summer, Kerby was my first boyfriend, and my family knew for a long time that I had liked Kerby, even though I didn't really talk about it very often. So anyway, we were over at my house. Kerby was over with my family, and Kerby and I were watching a movie just as friends. And then anyway, after the movie, he told me that he liked me and that he wanted to start dating me. And so this was at like midnight, like it was kind of late at night. And during this movie...
Just before midnight,
right.
It wasn't after midnight.
Right.
Just to be clear, parents were in the house.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, so during the movie, my younger brother and my sister, who's older than me, they kept walking by and they were like winking eyes and like nudging each other because they were like, "Ooh, what's going on?" Right? So anyway, after Kerby told me that he liked me and that he wanted to start dating me, I like ran into my sister's room and I was like, "Guess what? Kerby likes me." And then my brother, who's like 16 at the time, he's like, "Oh my gosh." And so anyway, we like run in to tell my mom, and it's like 1 a.m. at this point. So we run into my mom's room, we wake her up and we tell her, and me, my younger brother, my older sister, and my mom are all jumping up and down saying, "Kerby likes Meagin." And so anyway, it was definitely like a high point of actually the very first point of our relationship and a very high point.
Yeah, in some ways it was a high point. So, relationships, they have their highs and lows, right? It's not all singing and dancing in the streets, even though it may start off with dancing, in the living room. It can be challenging, and I think, maybe some of you are like me. It takes you a while to make a decision. Maybe even after a decision, you're like, did I make the right decision? Others of you, you know what you want even before you know that you could want it. And so, the story of our relationship was just beginning to come together, and there were definitely some struggles along the process. And, there's when you put romance and you put falling in love at first sight at the very beginning, then it can lead to some difficulties, and I think looking on the other side of romance, maybe we might see something different. There is some disappointment, and I think one thing that we realized through our relationship was just romance and infatuation are good. They're great things. They're fun. They lead to these kinds of movies, and yet they're not really a good basis for a long-term relationship. The stories we celebrate, the emotions we cultivate, they all point towards this idea of a relationship, but the reality is not altogether different, but it is different. And there are highs and there are lows. And we want to unpack just a few of the common misconceptions that are especially prominent in our culture today about love and relationships. So if any of you have seen the movie Jerry Maguire, it's a little bit older. It's famous for two lines, right? One is "show me the money," and the other is this one that you see on the screen. Tom Cruise's character, he says, "You complete me," and then what's her name? Yeah, Renee Zellweger, she says, "You had me at hello." So it must have been a very long hello, right? Okay, so one thing that's true that's represented in movies like this is our attitudes about marriage have changed. Marriage isn't something that's about us, but it's become something that's about me. Both of them are describing something that's happening to themselves. And I think we see two really contradictory things happening in our attitudes about marriage. The first is that we're too idealistic. Like he says, "You complete me." We look for someone to turn us into the person we always hoped we would be, to solve all of our problems, to fulfill all of our emotional desires. And at the same time, we become too pessimistic, almost in reaction to seeing that first one not pan out. If any of you have seen the show Sex and the City, it's about a group of friends in New York, and on the surface, it seems like they're having a good time. But if you pay attention to the dialogue, they're really disillusioned and very unhappy. And they're pursuing, kind of in pessimism, the same thing, for someone to complete them, to fulfill them, for them to get satisfaction out of another person. I think one book that really helped me was a book written by a pastor from New York, and he talked about the meaning of marriage, and I thought I'd share kind of an extra long quote with you just to illustrate and sort of expand on this idea that we want too much and also not enough from marriage at the same time. So here's what he says. "Marriage used to be a public institution for the common good, and now it is a private arrangement for the satisfaction of individuals. Marriage used to be about us, but now it is about me. But ironically, this newer view of marriage actually puts a crushing burden of expectation on marriage and on spouses in a way that more traditional understandings never did. And it leaves us desperately trapped between both unrealistic longings for and terrible fears about marriage." And then he continues, "The new conception of marriage has put us in a position of wanting too much out of marriage and yet not nearly enough at the same time. We are all looking for a marriage partner who will fulfill our emotional, sexual, and spiritual desires. This creates an extreme idealism that in turn leads to deep pessimism. We will never find the right person to marry." And I don't know if you all have experienced this, but when I was considering dating, people would ask me, "Is she the one?" It's like, if I knew that, we wouldn't be just dating right now. And I think on one hand, we all look for someone, and I think, we come to find that there is someone who God brings us to, and but there actually are a lot of people that God brings us to in friendships, in our family, and there's a philosopher who, occasionally philosophers write about things that we understand, and he wrote about relationships, and he said, the strange thing about relationships, about marriage, is that we never marry the right person, because in any relationship, we all change, right? Year after year, we become different, we become, new kinds of people, and so, if you think you marry the right person at first, well, just give it a few years, and she'll be someone else, or he'll be someone else. And I think he said the challenge of marriage is learning to love the person with whom you find yourself. And we understand that for sure with family. We probably understand that with maybe roommates or classmates, but for some reason we approach marriage a little bit differently. And we're going to share with you that we think marriage is actually very similar to those other relationships in some important ways. So here's some examples, just to put it in concrete terms, of how our attitudes about marriage have changed. One is typically, it seems common that people consider cohabitation to be better than marriage. Since the 1960s in the U.S., cohabitation has increased to over 50%, and that's people living together before they're married. And studies have also shown that people living together before they're married dramatically increases the likelihood of divorce once they do get married. And that's a really, it's concerning statistic that goes against what we commonly believe, but we still commonly believe it. Another thing is that divorce is inevitable. At least a couple years ago, the U.S. ranked number 10 in the world in terms of percentage of divorce, with a little over half. And it goes all the way up to 70% for Belgium. And we just kind of assume that that's the norm, right? We also seem to think that marriage is a financial drain and that most couples are unhappy with marriage, whereas studies typically show that married couples, in most circumstances, are more happier than unmarried couples. And that's just, a lot of that, there's nuance, right? We totally believe I was just as happy, even though it was a different kind of happiness before I was married than being married. And marriage is wonderful. But I think the idea that if you get married, it's actually going to be a drain is not actually true. So I think it's important that we get some clarity, right? Because it's really fuzzy, and if you just watch the movies, you're going to get a very skewed and sometimes pessimistic or cynical view of marriage. And the two things that we typically believe are that we think marriage, we have too idealistic view of marriage. Well, one of the reasons is that we underestimate the influence of sin. So if you get two people that have their issues, they have their selfishness, and then you put them together, that doesn't actually diminish the selfishness. If we do math, it actually multiplies it, right? Or at least adds it. In some cases, it multiplies it. And that's, that means that marriage is actually challenging, right? It doesn't automatically fulfill all of your dreams. The pastor that married us, he really likes to say during the wedding ceremony, as he gathers everyone together, he says, "Now marriage is an institution, and no one likes to be committed to an institution, but here we are." Yeah, being committed to an institution is a euphemism for being put in an insane asylum. So, that's his joke. The second thing is, our view of marriage is pessimistic and cynical, and that's because we really misunderstand what God has in store through the institution of marriage, and that it's something to change us, and for two people together to be a blessing to each other and to the community. And I really like the way the pastor puts this here, Tim Keller. He says, "The Christian teaching on marriage does not offer a choice between fulfillment and sacrifice, but rather mutual fulfillment through mutual sacrifice. It only works to the degree that it reflects God's self-giving love in Christ." When we were preparing to get married, we went to a marriage conference, and one of the things that stuck out to me the most was they said if you go into marriage, and really this applies to any relationship, on like a 50-50 basis, I do 50, you do 50, then you're getting into an accounting relationship, right? You're always counting, well, I did my 50, did they do their 50? And they said really the way you have to go into marriage as any committed relationship is you have to go in 100% both ways. Where you're not counting, you're not accounting, you're not keeping track, but you're giving your all. And this is really what we hope to unpack as a pattern for marriage, but also for relationships in general.
So this next slide says, this is a quote from a book called Everything I Never Told You. And it says, though they never discussed it, they both came to understand it as a promise, that he would always make sure there was a place for her, and she would always be able to say, "Someone is coming, I am not alone." And I like this quote because even though at first glance it looks like it's probably talking about a husband and a wife or maybe like a couple, it's actually talking about a brother and sister in the story. And so I think that one of the messages we wanted to make really clear is that you can find love that's really deep and meaningful and purposeful in all different types of relationships, not just the kinds that are romantic. And we're painted, so I think kind of like what we talked about at the beginning, we're always painted this picture through movies or through media or just even through what we think about romance, that marriage or love or finding true love is like this destination. And once we get there, we've arrived. But really, it's not like that. It's much more of a journey. And so there's a one moment where you meet the person, but that's just the beginning of the story. Or there might be a moment where you make a new friend, but that's just the beginning of that story. And so I think all of you could say that as you've become closer to your friends here at the conference or your friends back home, you've been able to understand more about who you are, more about who they are, and more about what love really is. And I think really at the core of that is that love always has to be rooted in forgiveness, and it has to be rooted in unconditional love, and it has to be rooted in being there for somebody through sickness, through health, through all of those things. And we can do that for someone that we marry, we can do that for someone that we're related to, and we can do that for someone that we're just friends with. And I think the ultimate example we see of this is through God. And I think, so we see this most perfectly demonstrated in the love of God. And I think that that's really important because we see this both in the ways that he loves us and how he calls us to love one another. And so the thing about the love of God is it's like what I just said, it's an unconditional love that pursues a person no matter what happens. And life isn't always perfect. Even when you find that your perfect person that you really care about and love, that doesn't mean that everything is going to be, like the first clip we watched where it's going to be bands and cartoon birds. Life is hard, and there's hard things that happen. And I think that that's where we really find true love, when it's a big or a small action towards a person that says, I care about you, I'm here for you. And it's choosing to sacrifice for a person, even when sometimes that sacrifice is really difficult. And so I think, that's a really important foundation of what love has to be rooted in. And so I think one thing I've really realized as I've been married to Kerby is that I first thought whenever I got married that it would fulfill this sense of longing inside of my heart. And I think that sometimes, even though that's not always a thing that we acknowledge, but we think that, whenever I get married or whenever I find my true love, I'm going to feel completely who I'm supposed to be. And my identity will be perfect, and I'll totally understand who I am. And really, that's not true, because I've been married to Kerby now for almost 5 years, and I still don't know who I am, and I'm still trying to figure
next
out.
Year.
Well, almost 5 years. So maybe next year I'll know, but we'll see.
Yeah.
But really what I've come to understand is that sense of longing, I think, is put in every single person. And I think that it's not necessarily a bad thing. I think that longing to continue to be seen and understood and known has been put into our hearts through our Creator and through God. And I think that God put that there so that it would push us towards him and help us keep searching for him and keep trying to understand who he is and how he's created us and who he's created us to be. And so longing isn't always a bad thing, and I think that it's something that can be really purposeful and really meaningful in our lives.
So as Megan was describing just kind of her expectations for marriage, I came into it with my own expectations. And the process of dating was a process almost of reprogramming, right? So my experience was that I was looking for, also, I guess in my own unique way, someone who would fulfill all of my dreams for marriage, all of my dreams for a spouse, someone who would both in, it's like you want someone who's smart but not too smart. You want someone who's pretty but also modest. You want someone who's like athletic but not like over the top, throwing weights at you and stuff. One time I dated somebody who had a pole vault pit in her backyard, and her whole family, they would pole vault in the backyard. She was nice. It didn't work out, but that's an example. But right, we have these unrealistic expectations. You want someone who's like stylish, but not like pretentious and shopping all the time. You want someone who like knows about the world, but is also very rooted. You want someone who loves their family, but maybe not too much. Maybe your family more. Anyway, we have these complicated expectations, right? And what that actually does, at least in my case, is it keeps you from making any decision at all. You're constantly evaluating, constantly feeling insecure about your evaluations, about your decisions, and I think that's a maturity thing, but it's also a reprogramming thing of coming into relationships with a different understanding of what they're about. And as I began to learn where these expectations came from, that they came from the movies I'd watched, the movies I'd heard about, it came from just sort of what was in the air, I had to start to think differently. And I remember I was living abroad. I was living in China. and we would buy DVDs because they were really cheap, and usually we could get them before they'd actually been released. Occasionally there would be someone walking across the screen. But I saw this one movie. I didn't get it, and I don't remember the name of it, but I remember the tagline. And the tagline said, if you're looking for love at first sight, you'll never stop looking. And it just hit me. I thought, and the movie itself is just a sordid movie of people, like relationships starting and stopping and mixing and matching, and it's not a happy story. And I thought that's how I feel, that I can't stop looking because I feel like I have to look for love at first sight. And years later, when Megan and I actually met, I think that helped me begin to reprogram a little bit. And there's one particular thing in the scriptures that I think really helped me understand and has helped our marriage. And we're going to look at part of that really quickly. So there's a passage that's famous for talking about marriage, and it's in Ephesians 5. And I want to point out one thing as we read it together. I'll start. It says, "Therefore be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God, submitting to one another." And he's talking about, kind of all of us, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. And then he moves on to marriage, and he says, "In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body." And there's so many, maybe some of you have heard sermons using this passage. It's often shared at weddings. And I want to just point out one thing that had not occurred to me until I began to think about marriage in a different way. And that's this line, "He who loves his wife loves himself." And I read that and I thought, that sounds really familiar. And it occurred to me that Jesus said something very similar, but more general. When someone asked Jesus, "What is the greatest thing a human can do? What is the greatest commandment? What are we supposed to do?" He said, "Love God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself." And I realized that's what Paul's saying right here. He's just applying it to the marriage relationship. And so I think one thing that I learned and that we've discovered together is that marriage is a specific kind of friendship. It's a special kind of friendship. So it's more than just a special friendship, but it is a very special kind of friendship. And it's built on the same foundation. Some have said that marriage is like a turbocharged friendship, which I think is funny, because if you turbocharge anything, it could either go really fast or explode. You're not really sure. It could be like those, like your Samsung Galaxy 7, or the little two-wheel things that you ride around on. Yeah, it could be like that, or it could be something better like a Tesla or whatever. But it's true, marriage is more than friendship, but it's not less than friendship. Your spouse is obviously your closest neighbor, so you should love your neighbor, the person right next to you. And I think in this way, it helped me put marriage in context. It's not about finding the person that you see them across the room and that's it. You might as well just walk down the aisle. But it's about friendship. And we have friendships all over the place, right? With our classmates, with people you've met here, with your family. These are just relationships in which we love our neighbor. And to the degree that we're good at those, to that degree, we can be good at marriage.
And I think that's what's so neat about being part of this world, being able to be with other people, is really that's true, that we get to have the adventure of meeting new people. We get to have the adventure of learning about who they are. And we get to have the adventure of learning more about who we are and how we're created through the relationships that we have. And if you've seen the rest of the movie Up, if you haven't seen it, you need to go see it. But if you have seen it, you know that really another primary character in this story is a little boy named Carl. And Carl comes into the story at a point, Carl is the old man. Russell is the little boy. So Carl meets Russell kind of by accident. And then the rest of the story is just about this unlikely friendship that he forms with this little boy. And at this point in Carl's life, he really felt like he didn't have a lot of love to give. And he kind of felt like his adventures were over. But really, he learns through his friendship with Russell that life is really meaningful and that he can experience so much love and so much goodness and so much joy, even just through this friendship with this little guy in just a different way than what he had with his wife, but still in a way that's really meaningful. And that's what we really wanted to encourage all of you with, that marriage or romance is not the destination. It's not the main thing that you should be searching for, but you should be looking towards being a good friend to the people that God's already placed in your life, and being a good friend to your family, being a good friend to your siblings, being a friend to your parents even, because it's when you're able to be a really true friend to a person that you're really able to extend love and kindness to them. And so throughout our lives, we get to invite people on this adventure with us. And it's through relationships that we're able to journey closer to the heart of God and to develop a better understanding of who we are and how He created us. And so really, these relationships don't have to just take place with just the person that we marry, but they can take place with just anybody that's in our life that God's put in front of us. And so when Christ is at the center of our identity and He's who we're looking to fill our need for longing, we're able to more fully love our family and friends. And that's really the core of the whole conversation. If you don't know who you are, then you can't really be a good friend to a person, because you're projecting all of your needs and your desires onto someone else that cannot fulfill them. And so I would just encourage you that as you're here at the conference and as you're learning about who God is, as you're learning about who you are, as you're learning more about your friends, they're really looking inside yourself and looking to your Creator to see, who am I? Who do I want to become? How was I created? And what does God have for me in my life? And I think once you really start to understand that, once you start to understand the love of God, then you'll really be able to love others more fully and more completely.
Well, we're going to take just a few minutes for some Q&A, just in case maybe that provoked a question, or maybe you came here with a question, and then we'll wrap up in a few minutes, but we appreciate y'all being here. You're going to have to be bold. And no question is off limits, but some may be more appropriate for just one-on-one conversation. So I'll help you with that. But anybody have a question they want to throw out, and we can talk about it. I'll restate the question. And so she was observing, which is accurate, that dating, at least the way you see it in the movies, is not common to all cultures, even though it may be increasing in many cultures. But especially, your experience, and I've observed this too, that dating can almost be like a game, where people are changing clothes, changing relationships like they're changing clothes, which, goes back to kind of what we're talking about. People, they're either pessimistic about marriage, and so they use relationships for lesser ends, or they're too idealistic and they get stuck on one person, even though that's not the right person. So how do we deal with this reality of, how do you decide how to engage in relationships towards marriage in like a cross-cultural context, right? I think that's kind of what you're asking. Yeah. Do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I can think about it. I think one thing that is helpful is to really, at least because I don't know, let me think about it. Hold on a second. Okay, I think one thing that's really helpful is just to think about, instead of just automatically dating that person, like if it's a guy who you don't know at all, or if it's a girl you don't know at all, don't just try to get to know them in a friendship way, try to get to know them through, group activities even, I think can be helpful. But I also think, so that's just one little bit of advice, just trying to build a friendship with the person, if you think they might be someone you're interested in. But then also, as you're thinking or considering about this person who's asking you out, it's important to understand and to see the character of the person who's asking you out. So you don't want to be saying yes to people who you don't really know them, or don't know their character, or you don't really want to be saying yes to people who you think might have bad character, because that's not the kind of person you really want to go on a date with. So anyway, I don't know if that's very helpful.
Yeah, I think that's good. And you're right. So the Bible assumes kind of a method of matchmaking that is more similar to Middle Eastern culture, where families are involved. Sometimes individuals have little choice, but it doesn't prescribe a certain way. And even as Christianity was expanding, they tried to adapt, or at least deal with differences in cultures between the Middle East and then going into Greece and to to Italy and all these different places. And one thing that was said that I think really helped me was the same person who wrote what we read earlier. He told one of the young men to basically, he addressed 4 different people, men that were older than him, men that were younger than him, women that were older than him, women that were younger with him. And he told them essentially to treat them all with respect and honor and to love them as a neighbor. And I think what we would hope to communicate that, you don't have to figure out the right method, because actually you may have to, and it may be better for you to stick with some of the traditions that you grew up with in terms of families being involved. We were really fortunate that our families were involved, but that's not normally the case here in the U.S. And if you're in like a cross-cultural relationship, you could have multiple expectations coming together. But if you build a foundation of friendship in community, then that can help you navigate differences in culture. If it can work out, it's only going to work out if you develop friendship. So I think Meagin's advice in terms of assessing people's character, that requires community. So it means if you don't know any of their friends, then either get to know their friends or just say, let's just be friends, right? And that means just friends. So that's that's what, I don't know if that helps, if that addresses the question. Okay.
So she asked, what is the right moment to get married? Specifically for the man, what is the right moment for him to get married? And do you have to have money to get married? I mean, it's helpful, like if you have some money, I would say that. Like, it's kind of hard if you're really, really living in poverty.
Right. So yeah, if you watch the movies or just think about it, look around. Yeah, dating is about romance, it's about sex, it's about all of these things, and we want to say that the Bible says no, that pursuing marriage is about pursuing friendships, and a very special kind of friendship, one that will be for life. Mm-hmm. And, at what point are you ready to cross that threshold? Obviously, you need some money, or somebody needs some money. Maybe they just give it to you, even if you don't have it, so that you can get married. But you don't need that much. We didn't have a whole lot when we first got married. We don't have much more now, but here we are. We both are reasonably dressed, and I don't know. I think some of that depends on kind of your family's expectations and your culture, and I think it's important to honor and respect those, but also not to wait until you feel safe. Now you want to feel safe about the other person, but not to wait until you've got everything in order, because that requires no faith at all. And I think the most important thing about getting married is establishing trust in each other to take risks together. And that may not mean that you have your job at a place where you're making 6 figures and you've got your house, or any of those things. It may mean you've got a job, and you can pay the bills. Like that's good enough, right? So, and whether or not you wait until you graduate, finish all of your degrees, that's a question that you have to consider. I do say dating for a long time can be very challenging, especially if you're trying to hold to some like moral standards. But it can just be challenging for the relationship too, because unless you're really patient, it can be hard. So, but I think marriage itself is designed to make us better people and to take risks together. And so the earlier you start on taking risks together, I think could be good. I think the formula is half your age plus 7. At least that's what I heard.
That's a fake formula.
No, I'm just kidding.
Okay, so Kirby's 6.5 years older than I am, so he's a little bit older than me. And I don't know if it I don't know if there's like a set, you have to be this much older, like this is not okay. But I think that like around 10 years is probably a good, for myself, I'm like, I probably wouldn't marry someone 10 years older than me, but that's just me, you might be okay with that. But I would say one thing that is a unique challenge, like if you are, okay, so like for Kerby and I, if we're talking about like, if I'm like, oh, when I was in junior high and I would go to my friend's house and we'd listen to, the Spice Girls. And then Kerby would be like, oh, well, I was in college when that happened. So it's like, there's some
This is really challenging. So
it's not that challenging. It's just kind of funny.
I can't reference movies because she wasn't allowed to see them.
Right. Or like your friends might be at different life stages as well. So that's just something to consider. But I don't know if there's like a set, you have to be this. Yeah, I don't think so. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, she said age range, depending on how old you are, makes a big difference. Like if you're 20 and you're going to marry someone 40, that's a huge age difference. If you're 40 and you're going to marry someone 50 or older than that, that's not as big a deal.
So how do you get through disappointments in relationships? Would you like to answer that one?
I think that let me think about this. Okay, so especially like when you're first getting to know someone, like your first year of marriage, you are bringing in your entire history of how you've dealt with stuff your whole life into that relationship, whether you're married to the person or you're just dating the person or you're just friends with that person. I'm sure if all of you have roommates at your dorms or whatever, you have experienced this, like conflict with the person because you're bringing in your own expectations. So sometimes your expectations for what you think the person should or should not be doing or how they should or should not be handling situations, like maybe they're not actually doing anything really wrong, but you're carrying in whatever your past history is with that. And so I think for myself, that was one thing I had to learn. I'm still learning with Kerby, is just that like when I get upset with someone, I tend to want to like give them the cold shoulder and just not talk to them or ignore them. Which is not good. Like when you live with the person and you have a baby with them and all of that stuff, like you cannot ignore them because you need their help. And so,
especially the baby.
Yeah. So I think like what the Lord has really helped me with over the past couple of years is I've realized like if I love Kerby, I don't want to hurt him like that. Like I don't want to deny my love to him. I don't want to I don't want to be like that. Not just to him. I just don't want to be like that to people in general. Like I don't want to hold grudges against people.